Halloween is my all-time favorite holiday, though whenever I try to figure out why, I always get stuck between whether it's the spooky festivities that it basks in, or the actual scary stuff that it's said to really be about. We carve pumpkins and put up fake spiders, not because they're scary, but because they're fun. Because the actual scary stuff is the stuff we don't want to remember or celebrate. Trauma can come from many places, but the media we consume on a daily basis tends to be a common source. And let me tell ya, I've seen some messed up crap. The kind of stuff that turn you from being this guy to this guy, you know what I'm saying? And although we don't like to talk about what we're truly afraid of, being brave and confronting it all needs to be done. And since this is my journey, not yours, I've included some timestamps in the description just in case you happen to find a certain segment too spoiler heavy or disturbing to watch. So turn the lights off, grab your unhealthy snack of choice, and get comfy. Though I'm sure that you won't be comfortable for long. Shazam was a pretty awesome movie. It was really funny, the villain was great. I really liked this shot of the eye reflecting in the glasses. It was so refreshing to just have another fun DC movie. Oh shit!
Outlook, not so good.
Well, we're off to a great start. You tend to find some of the hardest hitting horror in the most unlikely of places. Like when you play a horror game, most of the horrific things you'll see there gradually affect you less and less as you grow accustomed to the gloomy atmosphere. It's only when you're accustomed to an environment that you wouldn't perceive as scary that they start to really hit hard again. When you peel back the layers, Shazam is actually pretty screwed up. Like, even before this scene, there's a part where this woman touches the wizard door and then combusts into ash on screen. This movie is normally so lighthearted and fun in most places that these kinds of really disturbing scenes kinda come out of left field, which I think is what makes them so effectively terrifying. In fact, watching Dr. Sivana crash his father's boardroom meeting probably would have made anybody uncomfortable from the juxtaposition alone. Just watching Sivana walk into the room and lock the door behind him already carries a very ominous and sinister tone, but then the tension reaches its peak when he grabs his brother and throws him through the window. Not out the window, through the window at what I imagine to be over 10 stories high. Now, the stakes for ordinary people in superhero movies tend to be pretty low because normally the villains only target the heroes. You know, the ones who can actually defend themselves. And as such, any civilians can take comfort in knowing that the hero will keep them safe. Well, Shazam decides to say screw that, and so all of the people unfortunate enough to have been called to this boardroom meeting to discuss taxes or whatever are now met with some pretty grisly deaths. At this point in the movie, there was no hero to save Sid after he was thrown through the glass. No one to catch him at the last minute. That guy is freaking dead. And it doesn't even stop there. One of the deadly sins grabs this guy and chomps his head off before throwing him through the window too. All the board members are justifiably screaming in terror as they helplessly try to escape the room, their bodies being smashed against and pulled away from the translucent glass. And then there's Savannah's father, who is completely helpless and about ready to cry. He can't even stand up to run, and so all he can do is desperately call out for help. And as his voice falls on deaf ears, the only option he has left is to beg his son to let him keep his life. And after seeing his old man cow down to him in a cruel twist of fate, does Thaddeus decide to take pity upon his father? Nah.
You can have him. No.
Are we sure this is the same movie where Shazam uses his powers to buy beer, but then they think it's disgusting, so they buy a bunch of junk food instead? I think the purpose of this scene was to showcase Dr. Sivana's power and ruthlessness, as he murders his own family and anyone else who just so happened to be there just because he could. And if that's the case, then damn did it succeed. Do you guys remember Mr. Meaty? Because I sure don't. It was one of those shows that you would watch as a kid and then purge from your memory because of how messed up it was. Like in that one episode where someone built a robot to work at Mr. Meaty. What could go wrong?
My name is Chip. How may I service you?
Whoa.
You know, I really gotta give Mr. Meaty some props here. The regular characters in this show already look kind of creepy and uncanny, what with those beady, unblinking eyes and whatnot, but Chip here just looks even more eerie. I think it's the way that he moves his mouth when speaking that just really rubbed me the wrong way. Coupled with the fact that during the first part of the episode, he seems to do everything perfectly. A little too perfectly. And so there's this unsettling air of tension that looms over the entire episode, like Chip's gonna snap at any moment. And are you even seeing this thing? Chip looks like he's over 7 feet tall and weighs 500 pounds, heavy enough to make the ground shake. Imagine trying to defend yourself from that. Oh yeah, and did I mention that you can't even hide from it? If this thing were after you, chances are you're not getting away. And Chip is so unstoppable, in fact, that he can literally walk all over Parker, pick him up, and throw him into the kitchen. But thankfully, Parker manages to destroy Chip by exploiting his programming to follow orders. Though unbeknownst to the Mr. Meaty crew, Chip is actually able to repair himself, and once he finishes, things officially go from bad to worse, with Chip now being completely unhinged. Now with exposed wiring, nonsensical wording, and a proud display of his extra limbs, not to mention the uncontrollable twitching.
Every Chip has 40% potato.
If there were a time to run, it would be now. And since Chip has become so much more unstable and volatile, Parker decides that he has to try and make peace with Chip so that he doesn't have to worry about being murdered later. Though Chip doesn't really seem to appreciate Parker's olive branch, so he responds by aggressively assimilating Parker into the model employee circuit, essentially mind-controlling him. But when I watched this as a kid, I thought that Chip had actually gone all the way and turned Parker into a robot. He even does that creepy as hell mouth thing and his eyes turn a crusty metallic color. Just this image of the lifelessly robotic Parker, combined with how freaking terrified Josh is by the whole thing, made for a pretty traumatizing experience, as Chip is shown to easily be capable of overpowering and assimilating someone, thus reducing them to mere puppets, for lack of a better word, that Chip could do with as he pleases. Though aside from all that, I was also pretty disturbed by the guy who runs Mr. Meaty. Like, is there any reason at all that they made him look so undead? Also, I heard this episode had a sequel episode called Return of the Model Employee a couple years later, where the new and improved Chip 2.7 takes revenge on Josh and Parker. However, I can't recall anything from this supposed sequel. Plus, it, doesn't exist? No, really, I couldn't find anything on it. Every wiki page on it is either non-existent or has zero information besides this copy-pasted episode description. Any DVD lists I could find, including iTunes, only have Season 1 episodes, it's not on any video platforms or streaming services, and some episode lists feature it while others don't. Where is it? How did it get lost? Does it really exist? Can it be found? It's almost as if Chip accomplished something in this episode that he didn't want anybody else to see, so he purged it from the internet. My friends, we have to find this episode. We can't let Chip win. Kirby is such a lovely series. You walk the green pastures, you make new friends, you throw glass at your enemy's face till they bleed, you know. And you play as a lovable squish ball who doesn't have to deal with anything scary at all. Except maybe capitalism. Planet Robobot has always been a fascinating case, because this time around there's actually some interesting lore and backstory going into it. One with Haltmann losing his daughter Susie long ago and then not recognizing her when she returns. All thanks to this thing, Stardream, who's been robbing Haltmann of his memories for quite some time. That is, until things finally get out of hand as Stardream starts draining Haltmann of his soul too, as it promptly flies into space with the goal of destroying all organic life. But that's not the end of it, because when Kirby tries to stop the rogue machine, Stardream decides to pull a Majora's Mask and go completely insane. Even without context, you should be able to tell that something is very wrong here. We went from this static, cold-hearted machine that looks right through you, to this oddly creepy machination that's just weird and bizarre, which is somehow even worse because now this ordinarily lovable face is being twisted and turned. If this thing had a neck, I guarantee you it would be snapped about 10 too many times. And those glassy eyes, completely dead and cold, are always staring right into your soul. For some reason, this thing manages to carry more dread than every incarnation of the dark matter combined. And while I didn't notice it when I fought the regular version, after I got through the true arena and was greeted with this, it was like seeing a ghost. Because as I had expected, and then later confirmed, this was in fact the Galactic Nova from Kirby Superstar Ultra. And upon discovering that, I had a very real holy shit moment of disbelief. It absolutely blew my mind. Though I also had to take a step back when I realized that those nubs on its face are actually its mouth and not its chin. Though this also makes me wonder whether this is Stardream's true form, or if it's merely controlling this Nova like it's doing to Haltmann, who, in case you were still wondering, died during this fight. In fact, once you beat the Nova phase, Stardream ironically sucks Kirby up, giving him the chance to dismantle the core. And every time Kirby destroys one of the Nova Knuckles, you can hear Haltmann scream and moan in pain. And according to this juicy little tidbit, once we get to fighting the core itself, Haltmann's soul has apparently been completely purged from the system. Meaning that we are the ones who killed him, eradicating the pieces of his shattered soul, unaware of what we were even doing. And to think he would meet such a fate at the mercy of the very machine that he rebuilt, or reactivated, or found? Because apparently it's possible that there are multiple Galactic Novas built, so this may not even be the same one for Milky Way Wishes, but then... wait, did I see that right? No, it can't be. The connection is completely impossible. What? Was this power absorbed from Marks? Of the two become is this one? Actually the Could same Nova from Milky Way Wishes? How did Haltmann find it? What is going on? Well, this was unavoidable. Everything was fine at first. Birds were singing, grass was growing, creepy mascots were existing. But then 28 days pass, and all of a sudden the world is unrecognizable, as the undead and the infected roam the streets and turn this once proud world into a kill or be killed pathological wasteland. I guarantee you, nothing can screw a world over worse than a good old zombie apocalypse, which, in TV shows at least, tend to come in 3 distinct phases. First is the calm phase, where everything is okay and not messed up. However, this phase also bears the burden of carrying this intensely dreadful feeling of anticipation, where you know that something unholy is about to go down and you're just waiting for it to happen, while also vainly hoping that the characters are smart enough to not go through with it. But then, unavoidably, the storm phase kicks in and the world officially enters panic mode, as patients 0, 1, 2, and 3 manage to run amok and spread their disease throughout the area. Beloved characters being killed left and right, turned twisted up and down, heroes to villains and villains to even more villains. And in some cases, things get so bad that the characters have no hope of finding a cure and are just trying to survive as long as possible before becoming a slave to the horde themselves. And the final phase tends to end this type of story in one of 2 ways. Either a solution is found and everyone is restored, or everyone is infected and all hope is lost. In fact, zombies are surprisingly one of the grimmest horror tropes of all time, as this feeling of hopelessness pervades throughout the entire experience. Either the crisis is only averted by a hair, or the world is just permanently wrecked. The pathogen is normally spread through a bite or DNA transfer of some sort, but in the worst cases, merely touching a zombie is enough to make you one of them. And becoming a zombie can be worse than even death. Like, can we just take a step back and acknowledge what that would be like? First, you're fleeing for your life, but before you know it, they get you. The infection quickly hijacks your body and forces you to do whatever it needs. Whether that be brushing up against other victims, feeding on the living, or spreading the plague even further, all the while you're still there, either unconscious, trapped in your own body, or fully conscious, getting to see every detail of what you're doing, as you are unable to stop it. A great suffering that can only be ended by an intrepid survivor with a weapon, or a cure if you're lucky. And that grisly fate may not be the easiest to escape either. Sure, one zombie can be easy to avoid, but imagine trying to slice through hordes of them on all sides, their strength in numbers being enough to overpower anybody. Not to mention how most interpretations of zombies tend to give them superpowers, such as immense strength, damage resistance, wall climbing, and epic dance moves. And if you're trying to live in one of these worlds gone to hell, you're constantly on edge, nowhere is safe, and you'd always have to keep moving. All the while, one little mistake could spell your end. Zombies were absolutely one of my greatest fears as a child. Just the idea that something so horrible could happen in real life shook me to my very core, and live-action zombie stuff just made that anxious fear worse. Though nowadays, I'm thankful that I can take solace in knowing that such a thing could never, ever happen. Hopefully. I I've seen a lot of horror movies. Friday the 13th, Halloween, Sinister, A Quiet Place, Not a Quiet Place, Not Poltergeist, you name it. Though all of these movies I've noticed share one distinct connection, that being the silent, seemingly unstoppable antagonist, who either cannot be beat or must be worked around. Now, while having a villain that can completely overpower you and can't be reasoned with does sound pretty scary on paper, what ends up happening is that they only end up being as scary as what they do in their movies, as their lack of personalities don't really leave much to the imagination, the place where fear tends to grow and fester the most. It's only when you're able to think about something further and consider all the extra possibilities that its true terror begins to unfold.
Hello.
It could have been really easy to just make Pennywise another generic horror villain that simply kills people and doesn't talk. However, Stephen King and the crew adapting his book took the high road, and instead what we got was one of the most diabolical monsters that I've ever seen in a film. Pennywise really knows how to play people for chumps, as if they're puppets just waiting to be manipulated. To see what I mean, let's look at the famous drain scene from Chapter 1. In this scene, Georgie loses the paper boat that his brother Bill made for him in the storm drain, which Pennywise just so happens to pick up. Ordinarily, any kid would run away from the sight of a creepy clown in the sewers, but here Pennywise is able to use the boat to keep Georgie close, repeating that Bill will kill him if he finds out that Georgie lost it, playing into Georgie's fear of disappointing his older brother. And while it has him, Pennywise is also able to trick Georgie into trusting it too, because when Georgie says that he's not supposed to take things from strangers, as adults tell children to do all the time, Pennywise is able to break this cautionary advice in half by introducing itself, therefore making it not a stranger and eliminating any qualms Georgie could have about retrieving his boat, since by the logic of what Georgie's been told, only strangers will try to hurt you. And it was also able to quell Georgie's fears by flattering him with how many friends he must have and playing with him a little, which is shown to be effective as Georgie even laughs at one point. It's the perfect storm of mind games and manipulation, all done just to kill Georgie. This is not something you'd find in an ordinary horror film. Horror villains usually aren't this slimy, and that's because the objective for most of them is to kill, but for Pennywise, it's to terrify and terrorize. And so it relies more so on trickery rather than straight up attacking in order to maximize its victim's terror, which is illustrated in this scene, where it pretends to be Georgie and then tries to use Bill's sympathy for his deceased brother against him.
I wanna go home. I miss you. I wanna be with Mom and Dad.
Pennywise not only killed Georgie, but is now using him to get Bill to let his guard down so it can kill Bill too. It used Bill's own brother as a tool for psychological warfare. And even though Bill didn't fall for it, the trick still led to him being forced to shoot his own little brother in the head, which I imagine was deeply traumatizing for him. While others are concerned with leaving physical scars, Pennywise wants to cause you psychological damage. Whether that be killing someone you love and then showing you their ghost, encouraging you to kill your own father, making you feel powerless to stop its reign of terror, or just showing up only to troll you and leave. Were you to be in the same room as Michael Myers or Jason Voorhees, it'd be easy to imagine what they would do. They'd kill you, but be in the same proximity as Pennywise and all of a sudden you have no idea what to expect. What kind of trick will it pull? What kind of mental manipulation will it attempt? Will it simply kill you or save you for later? What will you see? Ah, jeez. Well, let's just continue. Horror stories tend to end in one of two ways. Either the conflict is resolved and everything is fine, or everyone dies. And the latter option tends to be the more disturbing route, since it often implies that the former would have been impossible to accomplish, that the threat this time around was just too unstoppable. And if it can't be beat, then what hope is there? Army of One is probably one of the most morbid tales I've ever read. The gist of it is that large groups of people have been randomly disappearing, only to later be found dead, stitched together, and strewn about. And every time one of these stitch murders occur, the questions on everyone's mind are always the same. How could this happen? Who is responsible? And why? Not to mention that either before or after one of these murders takes place, this mysterious group known as Army of One either hijacks the radio or has a plane fly around spreading thousands of identical flyers in order to deliver the same message. Gather round, people! All together now! Nobody likes a lonely only. Everyone's your friend. Everyone's your friend. When you join hearts and sing, Army of One. We're an Army of One. Everybody join hands now. Everybody join hearts now. Army of One! Ugh. Needless to say, this is some beyond messed up stuff. The Stitch murders supposedly only target people in big crowds, which must be what the champ means by nobody likes the lonely only, and all together now, perhaps to incentivize people to gather in groups. Or maybe, even more morbidly, all together now refers to the metaphorical army of people becoming one after one of the Stitch murders takes place. And God, what a creepy way that is to die. Your lips stretched across your face, your body connected and attached to other people via string, and then you're put somewhere as if you're some kind of decoration. And it's not subtle either. These bodies are being placed in areas where people would definitely see them, as if to send a message. As if to say that everyone is destined to become one of the Stitch victims. Obviously, all this sends everyone into a panic. Police officers are jumping and on high alert at the sight of anything even slightly suspicious. Michio's mother is scared to leave her room, which parallels the beginning of the story where Michio was scared to leave his room. And Natsuko, who is depressed and suicidal after losing almost all of her friends, including her fiancé. This crisis has brought Japan to its knees. People are afraid to go outside, to interact, to gather, to learn, love, and discover. All because nobody knows how to stop these terrible murders from happening. Nobody knows. And the less you know about something, the scarier it is. Nobody knows where this army of one came from, why they're doing this, or even how they're doing this. And no matter how hard anyone tries, it's all still hopeless. As shown in the final scene of the story, where Michio goes outside to see Natsuko, and the army of one plane happens to fly by, littering the area with flyers once again. But this time, 3 fighter jets rapidly pursue the craft. Michio, filled with a newfound hope that the culprits will be caught and the crisis concluded, rushes over to Natsuko's house, only to find Natsuko stitching her parents and dog together while reciting the infamous Army of One chant. Despite everyone having locked themselves in their rooms at this point in the story, this still happened. Even that couldn't save them. And as Michio looks on in horror, the same 3 fighter jets from before fly through the sky, spreading thousands and thousands of flyers across the area. Nothing can stop the Army of One. It's impossible. You may have noticed by now, but the idea of losing one's mind has been a continuing theme on this list. Whether it be becoming a slave to some infection or mass hysteria, or getting mind controlled by some rogue machine, the theme is the same. You lose yourself to something else, and one could imagine it's like falling into an endless abyss. And when we take solace in knowing that these kinds of things aren't real and can't possibly happen, we tend to forget that they have happened and are real, just in a different, less physical form.
Come on now, be strong. You can't let your womanly emotions consume you. You don't want to end up like your mother now, do you?
No.
I promise, one day this will all be a pleasant memory.
A big theme of BoJack Horseman is how people can be broken and then never fixed. Oftentimes this theme is applied to being depressed, or being unable to prevent making mistakes, or already making mistakes and then being unable to correct them. But for BoJack's mother Beatrice, it applies to her literal mental state. Since the beginning of Season 4, it's shown that Beatrice suffers from dementia. She doesn't understand what's going on around her, doesn't recognize people she knows, and has trouble distinguishing the past from the present. And while all that was kind of depressing on its own, it wasn't until this episode, Time's Arrow, that we're shown just how fractured her mind has become. This episode serves to show us Beatrice's backstory, but unlike what other shows would do, instead of it being a flashback, it's literally Beatrice's life and memories replaying before her in her current mental state. And so everything's wrong. Objects become blurry and people don't have faces, as if Beatrice can't remember what they looked like. She's constantly shifting between times in her memory, and often loses her composure and has to readjust whenever it happens, to show that she's not in control of what she remembers or when. And this constant shifting completely contradicts the saying of Time's arrow marches forward. If anything, this isn't Time's arrow, this is Time's pinball machine. And Beatrice is the ball, constantly getting smacked around, disoriented, and stuck. And given that these recollections are taking place in Beatrice's mind, that means that everything that happens has some kind of deeper meaning. Like in this scene where Beatrice is walking with Corbin Creamerman, and as they walk, the palette is very gray and dull, representing how bored Beatrice remembers being during this time, walking with this guy that she doesn't care about. But then when Corbin starts talking about his dreams and how his father doesn't understand his ideas, Beatrice feels incredibly touched. Because of the strained relationship she has with her own father, Beatrice is really able to relate to this. And so the colors brighten and the atmosphere warms up as Beatrice remembers how much she appreciated Corbin in this moment. But then on the other side of the coin, there's this scene with Beatrice's husband Butterscotch. And as they argue, Butterscotch says that he doesn't like groveling to his wife, hat in hand, but that a hat literally appears in his hand, which I think serves to illustrate how Beatrice's mental state has become so split that she's trying to fill in the blanks of her memory as she's remembering it. So when she remembers that Butterscotch said hat in hand, she fills in that he must have been holding a hat, whether or not he actually had one when this happened. And it brings up the very uncomfortable questions of what is real and what am I lying to myself about? Whose family portrait was really hung over that couch? Did Beatrice's dad really burn all of her things, or is this another false memory? Are these even real books? From what's being shown, it's like Beatrice is living in a waking nightmare every day, being forced to relive some of her worst memories over and over until she died one season later. And when she finally manages to bring herself back to reality by the end of the episode, she's scared and confused and doesn't understand any of what's been going on. And because she can't stay in the real world outside of her mind, Bojack decides to paint a pleasant fantasy for her to live in. Because even though he's resented his mother his whole life, even he can't stand to see her like this. And it's all just so sad.
In Michigan.
Michigan?
Yeah. At the lake house.
I am?
And it's a warm summer night, and the fireflies are dancing in the sky, and your whole family is here, and they're telling you that everything is going to be all right.
Yes, that's right. What else?
The crickets are chirping, and the lake is still, and the night is full of stars.
I can see it. It's so clear. What are we doing here, Bojack?
We're sitting on the back porch, and we're listening to your brother play the piano, and we're eating ice cream. Vanilla ice cream.
Yes, that's right. Oh, it's all so marvelous.
Can you taste the ice cream, Mom?
Oh, Bojack, it's so delicious.
Your biggest regrets in life will be what you didn't do, not what you did. This phrase has haunted me to my very core, like every day has missed opportunities, and by the time you realize that those were chances you wanted to take, it's already too late. Where does the time go?
This is not happening! I'm not old! 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 I'm not old!
Ed, Edd n Eddy was one of my all-time favorite TV shows as a kid. The characters were iconic, the episodes memorable, and it kept a consistent tone of lighthearted childhood fun. But then in comes Take This Ed and Shove It, which seemed like a normal episode at first. The Eds set up a career matching scam, which ends up being quite successful, so they used the money to buy jawbreakers as usual. But then, in an ironic twist, the careers they gave to the neighborhood kids prevent the Eds from enjoying them. They told Naz to be a dentist, so when she sees them with the jawbreakers, she confiscates them and locks them in her desk. Then as the Eds try to get the desk back to Eddie's house to get the jawbreakers out, the other kids' careers block their path as well. Business as usual, plenty of slapstick, great visual humor, and the Eds get a dose of karma while remaining likable. However, before the Eds can get the desk open and reclaim their jawbreakers, Eddie hits his head and wakes up as an old man. This is where the episode turns from a lighthearted venture showcasing a kid's interpretation of what adult careers are supposed to be, to a morbid story of a man whose life has escaped him. Ed, Edd n Eddy as a whole was all about the feeling of never-ending childhood fun. It was a fantasy. But here, that fantasy is smacked across the face by reality, even before Eddie wakes up as an old man. Characters begin to show more maturity and are eager to grow up, which in part was why the career matching scam was so successful, even though all the kids still only know adulthood from a child's perspective. In adult life, people get jobs for money, security, and other things, but most children just see jobs as things you're supposed to do because someone told you to do it. Otherwise, Sarah would never in her right mind have agreed to be a traffic light, or Jimmy a lumberjack, or Johnny a gopher. There's this innocent childlike air to it all, but then cut to Eddie as an old man and that air is gone. The Eds, and even all of the other kids, are now as old as one could possibly imagine oneself to be, looking very decrepit and close to death. Gone are the scenes of the Eds briskly running through the cul-de-sac, and in their place is Eddie, who can now barely walk. All the once young neighborhood kids are now different flavors of senile, and Eddie is in complete denial of this reality, despite the cane that continues to appear and reappear in his hand, reminding him of it. It invokes this horrible feeling of realizing how much time has passed and that you can't go back. Eddie tries to return to his younger life, believing that the still locked up jawbreakers are the key, but then they turn turned to dust before his very eyes, his only way out non-existent. This sends Eddie into an existential panic, where he bashes himself with that same cane repeatedly until he wakes up, as a kid again. And Ed is able to get the Jawbreakers out. Eddie is so relieved by this, and had the episode ended here, it could have been a nice, happy ending. Unfortunately, though, before Eddie is able to reclaim his Jawbreaker and his youth, he wakes up again, and it's revealed that the entirety of the show was just the Eds sharing stories from the past. And this really highlights the episode's major theme about age and perspective. The first part is about kids trying to be adults, adopting careers, picking up more mature qualities, and being responsible. But the second part is the opposite. It's about adults trying to be children, because now that Eddie is over 90 years old, he realizes just how little life he has left and yearns for the time he lost being a carefree child. And just to put into perspective how badly time can slip away, Ed, Edd n Eddy ended 10 years ago. I vividly remember watching the show back in the day, and it's already been a full decade since the Big Picture show first aired. And nothing feels worse than wanting to do something only to find out that it's too late. Which is why I implore you watching at home, if you have something that you want to accomplish later in life, start now, before you realize that it's too late. Because your biggest regrets will be what you didn't do, or rather, what you never got around to doing. Oh, you brave star children, you didn't heed my warning up until now, but I'm giving you a second chance, as this is the grisliest part of the list. Just a reminder that there are timestamps in the description for a reason. Alright, I give my best to the brave, just know that I warned you.
Stefan, please.
Dad, please get away from me!
Dad, I'm on control. Please. I'm on control. Stefan, I'm on control.
In case the poster wasn't any indication, Black Mirror Bandersnatch goes so deep and has so many layers that you would mistake it for an onion. What starts off as a seemingly fun and insanely unique choose-your-own-adventure movie turns into a mind-bending trip that'll have you questioning your own free will. This movie is meta like you would not believe. This is a choose-your-own-adventure movie about Stefan, who is making a choose-your-own-adventure game based on a choose-your-own-adventure book, all of which go by the same name: Bandersnatch. And throughout the movie, you're tasked with making choices for Stefan, which makes him paranoid about his own autonomy. And as the movie goes on and Stefan is convinced more and more that he has no free will, the viewer begins to feel the same way because, despite being able to choose between prompts, the viewer doesn't have a say in where the story goes either. They don't get to choose which prompts appear. This completely shatters the ordinary character-viewer relationship, as it means they're both in this mess together and they're both being pulled by strings. And so you're forced to do and watch these terrible things. All of a sudden, the moments of picking your preferred cereal or which music you'll listen to are gone, and the situation ends up escalating so high that Stefan ends up killing his own father. Now, when it comes to killing and death, in movies and video games alike, it's easy to disassociate yourself from the violence because it's either beyond your control, not your character's doing, some random mook that nobody cares about, or you're given the courtesy of being spared all the grisly details. But Bandersnatch is different. By having the viewer pick which actions Stefan makes, that in turn makes them responsible for almost everything he does, including when Stefan kills his dad. Stefan repeated over and over that he wasn't in control before he bludgeoned his dad to death, and he only does that after you give him the prompt to do so. Stefan's dad didn't just die. You killed him. You decided his fate. You chose for him to die. You watched him fall over and expire as the blood poured out of his forehead and the light poured out of his eyes. And you decided how Stefan would carry out concealing the body. You did this. I'm sure you didn't want to do it, but neither did Stefan. And yet, despite your morals, here you are, being led down this dark path. This is the sort of thing that will make you question your own free will, just as Stefan does. If someone is always making choices for you, then do you truly have control over your own life? Or are you just at the mercy of this someone's agenda? And essentially what Bandersnatch has done is turn you into a monster, a murderer. It makes it quite clear that you caused this to happen. And even after the murder, you have to go through either burying the body, or worse, chopping it up. And should you choose the latter option, you're subjected to watching in horror as Stefan takes a saw to his once very alive father who only wanted the best for him. And because the death of Stefan's father is one of the most key moments in the entire movie, you get to see it over and over and over and over and over and over, just to hammer in what you've done. This is objectively horrifying. Bandersnatch put a knife in your hand, and before realizing it, you'd already killed someone with it. And let's just say that this scene really didn't sit right with me. I don't know, it just felt too real. All because I was the one that made that decision. I could have chosen not to choose. but I didn't. Stefan's dad died because of me.
It was your choice. You get to live with it.
Before we get to number 1, I thought I'd share some honorable mentions because there are a lot more disturbing things out there that I just couldn't escape from. Road to the North Pole from Family Guy. It's easy to imagine Santa Claus as this magical being who serves to spread joy to all the world's children, but when you really think about it, if being Santa were a real job, it would be the hardest job in the world. You'd have to sift through hundreds of millions of messages to find out what everyone wants, somehow perfectly recreate and deliver that literal mountain of presents accurately to everyone in the world, all in one night mind you, and do it every year without any sort of break or proper payment. And this impossibility is reflected in Road to the North Pole, which portrays Santa's workshop as a morbid factory, mass-producing presents due to the extremely high demand for them. And due to this industrialization, everything in the shop has become twisted. The elves are hideously deformed, the reindeer have gone feral, and this version of Santa is depressed, cynical, malnourished, and sick, a far cry from the jolly old saint we all know and love. It's such a depressing take on the holiday that you don't normally see, not only for the wicked imagery, but also for the implication that someone likely died just so you could have that random thing that you probably won't use again. The maid losing her face from Scream Queens. For the record, I have no idea what this show even is. It was just on and I decided to stick around. But then this happened and I really wished I hadn't. The scene starts with this bratty college girl trying to drown her maid in the fry oil. You know, as you do. But then it turns out that the fryer is actually on, so she stops trying to murder her, and then, her face now looks like a bloody fried potato with loose skin, which she squeamishly tries to peel off before falling over and dying. Oh my god, that is just horrible and disgusting on so many levels. The Schifozoa from Code Lyoko. Most of the enemies in Code Lyoko aren't too complicated, just simple goons that aim to attack and are moderately vulnerable. But this simplicity isn't quite the case for the Schifozoa, where, instead of attacking, it'll slowly approach until within range, and will then try to wrap its victim in its tentacles and do whatever it desires with them as they are unable to escape. And out of all the monsters on Lyoko, the Schifozoa is the only one that seems completely invincible, because unlike the other monsters, the Schifozoa has never been killed, only driven off, and any attack directed at it doesn't appear to deal any damage. It's kind of like those enemies from stealth sections in video games that give you an automatic game over whenever you get caught. Oh hey, speaking of which, the Silent Realms from The Legend of Zelda Skyward Sword. Juxtaposition is what makes this place stick out. When you first enter the Silent Realm, it's a calming and bright area that becomes completely heinous and bloodthirsty as soon as you take your first step, with the madness only ceasing once you collect one of these goddess tears, which delay the Armageddon by 90 seconds. But when that time runs out, or you're unfortunate enough to get caught in waking water or the light of one of these watchers, the tension rises significantly and now these guardians are after you. And as you may have already guessed, they will constantly pursue you until you either collect another tear, or they catch you and you have to restart the trial over again. And each of the Silent Realms are beyond stressful for this reason. Apparently it wasn't enough to just restart the trial when you get caught. The game also has to scare the crap out of you too.
Because Christmas time is killing us. Killing us! Christmas time is killing us.
Welp, looks like I'm doing this in the dark now. Oh god. You know, it's funny. Things that terrified us as children often don't leave the same impact on us when we're older. You remember being traumatized by something as a kid, but then you watch it again years later and all of a sudden it's not that bad. Yet confronting your fears doesn't undo the damage. All of us are the products of our upbringings, as the various factors and influences we are exposed to as children always crop up in other areas of our lives. And all it takes is one bad experience for an irrational fear to be born and survive, even past childhood, especially if that fearful thing is all around you. I hate mushrooms, and I'm pretty sure this episode is the reason why. Sure, Ben 10 is no stranger to creepy extraterrestrial stuff like Kevin, the D and aliens, or all the stuff with Ghost Freak, but something about Camp Fear just stuck with me like some kind of invisible fungal parasite, and I'm not entirely sure why. Perhaps it was the way that the fungus in this episode was portrayed that got me, because throughout the episode, the fungal threat seems almost completely unstoppable. When Ben, Gwen, and Grandpa Max arrive at the camp, it's deserted, a complete ghost town, and the camp appeared to have been emptied so quickly and recently that the meals in the dining hall are still warm even. What happened? Did the entire camp evacuate to escape the fungal menace? But then if that's the case, why was Gilbert here walking into the middle of the road with a really bad rash as if he escaped an attack? Could it be that everyone else in the camp who tried to flee didn't make it? It would certainly seem that way because these things are apparently so strong that they can lift an entire backhoe loader and toss it like 20 feet. So it wouldn't be too far-fetched to assume that these things could overpower any person they got their appendages on. The whole episode gives off this feeling of being trapped and overwhelmed, and that no matter where you run, there's always more to run from. Like when everyone leaves the RV to investigate the camp, and when they return, they find a mysterious fungus has covered the engine, trapping them there. And then before you know it, the entire camp is covered in gargantuan stalks and caps. Meanwhile, these rogue mushroom creepers roam the area, making constant growling and clicking sounds. These guys really stuck with me. I'm not sure why, but there's something about them and the rest of the creatures in this episode that just look uniquely alien and otherworldly. When Ben stumbles upon the overrun quarry, it gives off this feeling of discovering something new and strange that can't quite be comprehended. No one knows where these monsters came from, besides that they were a dormant species, or even how something as simple as a fungus could grow to become such a force, with new terrors constantly emerging from the ground, mushrooms covering the entire area, and these mushroom creeps in every direction, all topped off with these cordyceps-like stalks bursting out of the earth, as if the planet itself is merely a host to a parasitic infection wishing to spread its corruption further.
Struggle as you may, you cannot stop me. Soon, I will consume every living creature on this planet.
And if it hadn't been for the athlete's foot powder that kills all kinds of fungus, Ben, Gwen, Grandpa Max, and the 3 campers they met would all be dead. The fungal hive mind was so efficient at cornering everyone that if it weren't for the foot powder, there would have been literally no escaping or stopping it. This episode takes ordinary earthly things and turns them into these horrifying cosmic terrors. And needless to say, it's the kind of childhood horror that I'll never forget. Speaking of which, I have no idea where I am. How did I get here? Was I just so swept away by the Halloween spirit that I simply wasn't paying attention to where I was going? Crazy how dark it is out here too. Like, wow. I don't see a single star in the sky. Must be a new moon too. And what a crappy lantern this thing turned out to be. I mean, I'm not exactly sure what I was expecting from an old busted up lantern that was just lying around, but you think it would last at least 1 hour. And what was with all that crazy wind? Not only was my hat about to fly off, but I swear it wasn't natural. It felt so weird, I can't quite describe it. I should get out of here. Frankly, I'm not really in the mood to get murdered today. Right, going. Honestly, it was probably a bad idea to come here anyway.
Silly me. Monsters aren't real.
Does she love me for who I am? Or does she want to put my brain in a can?